What kind of man was David that he didn't rejoice at the news of the death of Saul, his mortal enemy, who for more than 10 years had wanted to take his life? Moreover, David composed a song of mourning in honor of Saul and his son Jonathan, and commanded the people to learn this song. What astonishing lessons can we learn from this unexpected behavior of the one who was truly a man after God's own heart? It was normal for David to mourn for Jonathan and the people of the Lord. But here we see David also mourning for Saul and his servants, who were none other than his mortal enemies, those who slandered him and who, without cause, set traps to take his life for years and years. But David is free from himself and from the obsession of his own revenge. He left this problem before the Lord. Certainly Saul's death meant David's revenge, but David puts the honor of God's name above his own justice. From David's perspective, Saul's death meant his rehabilitation before Israel. From the perspective of God's plan with his people Israel, his death marked a great defeat, both physical and spiritual. Saul had been the Lord's anointed who died in sin, and Israel's defeat gave the Philistines an opportunity to blaspheme the Lord's name. David interprets the event of Saul's death primarily from the perspective of God's plan. So even the news of an enemy's death is a test from God. David does 3 things that prove he passed this test. First, he took hold of his clothes and tore them. He wept and fasted until evening. It was a spontaneous and immediate reaction that set an example for his men who did the same. The author specifies that the grief was also for Saul, and not only for Jonathan and the people of the Lord. David was not putting on an act. His grief was sincere, and he expressed it publicly to provide a worthy example for his people to follow. The second thing David does is to order the death of the Amalekite who brought the news. The Amalekite did not know that David was a unique king on the face of the earth. The royal crown and the bracelet from Saul's arm meant nothing to David. He was totally healed from the pursuit of fame and power. Moreover, David left the matter of his own revenge to God. As far as he was concerned, he still related to Saul as the Lord's anointed. Even though Saul was presented as dying and asking to be killed himself, David still considered it a crime worthy of death. Again, Scripture shows us that euthanasia is a practice condemned by God's people. David respects the order established by the Lord in Israel until the end and shows deep respect for Saul and his position even after his death. And as if what he had done so far wasn't enough to prove his attitude and respect for Saul, David does something else. He writes a lament in honor of Saul and commands the children of Judah to learn it. He wants all of Israel, as well as future generations, to know what his reaction was to Saul's death. David understands his role as a model, as a landmark in Israel, and he doesn't hesitate to play it. He doesn't suffer from too much modesty, and he knows how to be an impactful role model. In fact, the first function of the Lord's anointed was to reflect the beauty of the King of Kings before his people Israel. David had every reason to rejoice at the news of Saul's death and to write a song of joy. The Lord had finally avenged him. The period of persecution was over. The throne awaited him eagerly. And yet David weeps, and he weeps for Saul, not just for Jonathan, and he wants all of Israel to know that he mourned for Saul. Lord, what did you build in David's heart? Was he angel or man? What do you need to know about God to write a song in honor of the one who was your mortal enemy and stole 10 years of your life? Certainly the fact that Saul was an Israelite and the Lord's anointed mattered. David sees him even after death through the lens of the function that God gave him. He finds the strength to look at what was good in Saul even after he was judged by God. Saul was the Lord's anointed. Saul was brave. Saul brought many victories to Israel. Saul loved Jonathan. But he doesn't mention anything about the fact that Saul was rejected by the Lord, that he wronged David, that he was paranoid, that he initiated a genocide. David was concerned about the spiritual health of the Lord's people. Everyone had been wronged in one way or another by a brother and was thirsty for revenge. But the law stated very clearly, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor, but you shall not bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Leviticus 19:17-18. David did not want to support a flood of revenge and hatred among the Lord's people. On the contrary, he wanted to be a role model in forgiveness, in trusting God who will do justice, in respecting the law and the authorities established by God, in caring for the heart of God, who does not desire the death of the wicked, and for the honor of his name before the nations. He wants to snatch the Israelites from the narrow horizon of their own righteousness and connect them to God's eternal plan. It seems that in the years spent in caves and wildernesses, David drew near to the heart of God, which is first of all a God of mercy and love. David profoundly understands that God is first and foremost love and mercy. The outpouring of mercy, not judgment, is what best reflects the essence of God. This does not mean that God gives up his justice or will not execute judgment on earth, but it means that his first option, his ardent desire, is that of reconciliation and the outpouring of salvation. David seems to understand this too. Although Saul had been judged by God, David knows that the Lord did not desire the death of the wicked, and that in fact the great desire of God's heart was Saul's salvation. David comes to truly love Saul and to weep with God over the tragedy of his life. David does not deny Saul's mistakes, nor the judgment that came from God upon him. This was evident before all Israel. But what was not evident was the pain in God's heart for the one who was once the pride and hope of Israel. Saul was not an Amalekite, but was part of the Lord's people and had been anointed as king over Israel. If we look at the history of the kingdom of Judah until the Babylonian exile, David's dynasty endured, and no king was removed by murder or revolt. Only Queen Athaliah tried to kill David's descendants, but the people came to the aid of the house of David. In contrast, in the northern kingdom in Israel, dynasties changed frequently, and sometimes they were changed by murder and revolt. David's example, however, established values in the consciousness of Judah that were preserved for hundreds of years, despite the spiritual decline in Judah. This is what an example means. David's reaction to Saul's death becomes a landmark for hundreds of years for Judah's relationship with the one who would be anointed as king. Do you want to be a person after God's own heart? Look carefully at David's example and follow in his footsteps in your relationships with your fellow human beings and especially with your enemies. May your life reflect the heart of God, full of mercy and compassion even for the most rebellious people. Ultimately, God fully revealed this heart on the cross when his Son, the descendant of David, died for the sins of the world. For his sake, let us clothe our hearts with much kindness, love and long-suffering for everyone who is our neighbor.